By now, many of you are probably aware of the controversy surrounding Elon Musk's repost of a tweet claiming that dictators like Stalin, Mao, and Hitler didn't personally murder people, but that their public sector workers did. Now, this post has sparked a fresh round of debate and a wave of backlash, as you can imagine. Some Tesla owners even talking about selling their cars, calling them swasticars in protest. But here's the thing. We've actually explored this topic before, the question of Hitler and how Christians should understand and respond to extreme evil, especially when people identify as Christians while committing atrocious acts. And today, I just want to refresh our conversation about what it really means to follow the teachings of Jesus, particularly his command to love our enemies, even in the most challenging of scenarios. And if you're curious for more detail, be sure to check out our video we actually did on this topic entitled, "What About Hitler? A Christian Perspective." I'll put a link to that in the description box. But for now, let's just dive in to why this conversation really matters. Musk's tweet reignited age-old questions about how do we confront or talk about figures like Hitler from a moral or spiritual standpoint. Does the existence of a monstrous dictator, someone who orchestrates genocide against a people, does he render Christ's teachings on nonviolence and enemy love obsolete? And in my opinion, it's a critical conversation because many people assume the Hitler scenario disproves any notion of Christian nonviolence. But that thinking, in my opinion, misses the historical and spiritual nuances at play here. Now, for the sake of a quick recap from our video called "What About Hitler?", we walked through several key points. The first was the fact of the historical context. So Nazi Germany was overwhelmingly Christian, about 94% Protestant or Catholic. Now, Hitler expressly used Christian imagery and rhetoric to gain support from this Christian population. The soldiers wore belt buckles inscribed with Gott mit uns, which literally means God with us, reflecting their belief that they were acting underneath God's approval. So too, there was Christian complicity in that many German Christians, particularly Protestants in rural middle-class areas, were major supporters of Hitler. And this begs a very uncomfortable question of what if German Christians had seriously committed themselves to following Jesus' commands to love enemies instead of helping Hitler kill his enemies? Could history have been different? And I'm convinced that it could have been. We also see the misuse of Christ's name in the fact that Hitler presented himself as aligned with Christian values, but he warped the faith for political ends, which we see by many people aside from Hitler. And that's a warning against conflating a religious identity with nationalism and violence in particular. And we also need to say that nonviolence, unlike what the detractors will say, is not naive. Christian nonviolence isn't about passivity, as we've shown over and over again. It's an active stance that, if embraced, can actually undermine oppressive regimes at their roots. And history shows examples of this. Many people opposed Hitler, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. And so, in short, what about Hitler? This video we did, the question, what do we do with Hitler, is less about punching holes in Jesus' teachings and more about exposing how drastically Christians and all people can stray from Christ's command to love. Now, Musk's repost says Hitler didn't murder millions personally, but his public sector workers did. Now, in one sense, that is factually correct. Hitler orchestrated the genocide, but others carried it out. However, from a Christian perspective, recognizing that tens of thousands of these quote-unquote public sector workers also identified as evangelicals, as mainline Christians, as Lutherans, as Catholics, that's the real gut punch here. The deeper issue is not really who physically pulled the lever. It's why so many who claim to follow Christ went along with these murderous commands. And that's where nonviolence and real enemy love should have confronted the machine of genocide. And tragically, it often didn't. Now, in that earlier video of What About Hitler, we concluded that the real question that should be asked is not what about Hitler, but rather what about us, right? How do we respond to evil around us? How do we ensure that we're not co-opted by political, social, or nationalistic currents that lead us to commit or condone violence? You know, the truth is anyone can wave a Bible around or mention God's name, but true discipleship requires living out Jesus' radical teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, even when it's dangerous, even when it's costly. And the lesson here is that if the church in Germany had firmly refused to compromise on nonviolence, perhaps Hitler's regime would have been weakened from within. So here's the big takeaway. The mention of Hitler should compel us to double down on the question of whether or not we're living out Christ's commands to love. The question of what about Hitler should not serve as some sort of proof text to nullify nonviolence. Instead, it should be seen as a sobering reminder of what happens when we fail to truly follow Christ, which I think is something that all Christians can reflect upon today, especially when these modern controversies flare up. And as I mentioned, if you want to go further into depth on this topic, you can revisit that earlier video. It's called What About Hitler? Again, it's in the description box. It's essential viewing, I think, if you're wrestling with how we apply Jesus's radical teachings on nonviolent love to some of history's darkest chapters. Now, my personal conviction is that the kingdom of God operates on the principle of nonviolent love, even towards those who are violent. And history shows us that neglecting that love opens the doors to atrocities. This is why we should not shy away from evaluating our own actions in light of Jesus' commands to love. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.